we're down to Proverbs chapter 31 in this class. We have been working our way through the Proverbs now for several weeks. And we've reached the concluding chapter, which is probably one of the most recognized sections within the book of Proverbs. There are several verses that we often refer to. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God, is one that we often use. Train up a child in the way he should go. We use that verse. Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 6, add not to, take not from the word. We are familiar with verses like that. But this particular section is a rather lengthy section, especially once we get down to verse 10. It deals with what we often refer to as the worthy woman, or the virtuous woman, as is suggested in the text itself. And so we'll look at that here just shortly, but there are about 9 verses before we get to that point that we need to look at as well. In verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. Now, who is King Lemuel? Was he king in the north or king in the south? All right, there is a lot of discussion, if you did much reading on that. There's even some discussion that the name or the reference to Lemuel is actually symbolic of any ideal king who has been taught by an ideal mother, as is obviously indicated with the following verses. Some have tried to suggest this is a reference to symbolically to Solomon, which seems to be very little evidence for that. Some have suggested more likely it is a symbolic reference to King Hezekiah, who was one of the better kings of the tribes of Judah during the division, the north and south of the nation of Israel. But it's just simply one of those situations with which we do not have concrete evidence. Some translations will refer to him as king of what? Who's got an off reading there? Massa, M-A-S-S-A. But that would not fit, because if you look at the background of Massa, that was one of the Arabian tribes that really descended from Ishmael. So that wouldn't fit the nation of Israel or anything that has to do with it in that regard. And so, you know, when it's all said and done, we just basically have to face the fact that we don't know exactly who the author of these 10 verses is. But obviously one who was inspired, because of, in the original language, the word oracle is used in verse 1, which suggests an inspired utterance. And so it really doesn't make that much difference as to who the actual penman is, as long as we know that he was an inspired penman. And so if you try to dig in a little bit to that first verse and the significance of it, you found some of those difficulties that we often would find. But in that regard, we talk about, and the verse talks about his mother. It's interesting when you again read some of the history of the Israelites and others connected with them through the years. Oftentimes the king's mother actually took precedent over the king's wife. And so it would not be anything unusual here that here is a king, an ideal king, if you please, because of the instruction that he's received, if he follows it, who has been taught by an ideal mother, who would give him advice that would protect him from the woes of the ways of the world, and would result in righteous judgment on his part. And so when we look through these 9 verses and see there are at least 3 exhortations or admonitions that are given to this king by his mother, that certainly leads to righteous judgment, by which those 9 verses close out, as we'll get to that here very shortly. And so it's not unusual that the king's mother would be referenced in that regard because of the position that a king's mother occupied during the reign of the king of that sort. In verse 2, you have a repeat 3 times, the word what my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows. Why do you think 3 times the word what might appear? I mean, just regardless of the context, just a repetition of that sort. What would it suggest? Emphasis. Something urgent is about to be said by this one who is giving advice. It would get the attention of the son by the fact that the mother would repeat it 3 times. But it could also suggest the extraordinary concern that the mother had for the son, because she would repeat it 3 times to be sure she got his attention. And so, I mean, how often have we emphasized the fact that when God says something once, that's sufficient, isn't it? If God said it, it's important. But if God, through inspiration, repeats something 2 or 3 times in a row, what does that say to us? Give attention. Here's something of special importance, if you please, to which we need to take heed. And so if there is, whatever the significance to verse 2 might be, certainly that would be included. There's another interesting statement in verse 2, when in the last phrase he is referred to as the son of my vows. Does that ring a bell anywhere? Well, I hadn't thought about the marriage vows, but the son, think about the phrase, the son of my vows. Think about that phrase. Huh? Well, you might want to think of that. There you go. Samuel's mother, who was she? Hannah, there you go. What vow did she make? Or God, if you will bless me with a son, what was she planning to do? What did she promise? What did she vow to do? Dedicate him in service to God all the days of his life, primarily. When you look at this particular section, the word Lemuel, that we've already covered, which is probably a symbolic reference to one of the kings, but the very name itself means unto God or dedicated unto God. So when you see that phrase, the son of my vows, it's much like the concept of the vow that was made relative to Samuel, that he would be given in service to God all the days of his life. So here's one who's dedicated to God. And that being the case, there's certain admonitions or exhortations or whatever word you might want to use there, that this mother gives to this son because of the fact that he is dedicated to God in that regard. Now when you come down to verse 3, you begin to see the admonitions that are given. Verse 3 gives the first admonition. When she says, give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. What's the admonition? Don't give yourself to strange women. Now, you might think in that regard, who in his kingship failed in that regard? David, but more than David, Solomon, How many wives did he have? How many concubines did he have? And so he really failed miserably in that regard, didn't he? Most scholars suggest to us that the last phrase of verse 3 is what is often referred to as a parallelism. That is just another way of saying the same thing that's said in the first place. So if that is the case, then if you give your strength to women, what's going to be the outcome? Destruction. Now, how many times have we seen that throughout the Proverbs? In principle, at least, we have seen that over and over and over again. How that the attention is drawn away from righteousness to strange women, and we've seen that over and over and over. And what's the end result? It's destruction. And that's the advice that this mother gives to this king in this regard. Know the end result of your actions is in essence what is being said. Is that good advice for us today? Not just with regard to strange women, but what about our actions in any area of life? Do we not need to give consideration to the end result? Where is this going to lead? If it is, if we follow through, if it's carried through to its ultimate end, what's going to be the end result? And if destruction is the answer, then what ought we to do? Stay away from it. Leave it alone. And that way, certain destruction is not going to be our fate in that regard. So the first admonition then is to stay away from the women, obviously in this case women that did not belong to him. The second admonition really covers verses 4 through 7, in which he said, "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert judgment of any of the afflicted." So the first part of the admonition is, in the first place, stay away from it. Stay away from strong drink. Now again, that's reemphasized over and over and over through the Proverbs and in various ways in that regard. And you see the thing that he's dealing with here as far as strong drink is concerned. I found a couple of interesting quotes in that regard. One quote said, "Where drink enters, wisdom departs." True or false? It's very true, isn't it? Where drink enters, wisdom departs. When one is so influenced by strong drink, they lose their sense of reasoning, and that's really what is going to be said here in just a moment. The other quote that I ran across was, "When wine goes in, the secret comes out." There's a lot of truth to that, isn't it? You get a man just a little bit on the intoxicated side, and what will he tell you? Anything you want to know and then some. We saw that earlier within the Proverbs. And so here is just a re-emphasis of some of the same principles that we've seen over and over within the Proverbs as we've covered these various sections. But then the reason for kings not to drink wine is what? In verse 5, there's the reason for it, for this warning. If you forget the law, that's the first danger. You're going to forget the law. And when you forget the law, what's going to happen to your judgment? It's going to be perverted. It's not going to be accurate. It's not going to be right. And so, how many people is a king going to affect? The whole nation. And so, obviously, the warning in that regard. Now, the same warning and reasoning can be used on an individual basis, because how many of us live on an island by ourselves? None of us. We all influence others around us. we may not influence a whole nation, but we influence a certain number of people. And when we consider our actions in that regard and just exactly who is going to be affected by our actions, it just simply says to us that we need to give serious consideration to anything that would have an adverse effect on our judgment that will affect our actions. That's really what this is all about. Then he goes further in verse 6 and says, "Give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Let him drink and forget his poverty. Remember his misery no more." Now, in verse 5, he said it's not for kings to do this, but give strong drink to them that are ready to perish. Is that really a conflict of ideas? On the surface, it might seem to be. But when you think about Paul's admonition to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 23, what did Paul say to Timothy about drinking wine? For medicinal purposes. For medicinal purposes. Not for social purposes, as some people would have us believe, but for medicinal purposes. And so, when you look at the context here, in all probability, that is the consideration. So the warning in these verses 4 through 7, is really giving us what might be referred to as a very debasing trio. And it's often expressed in our language, 3 things. What are they? Wine, women, and song. And how often have we heard that? And that's what the world would have us to think about. You remember back in the book of Amos? What was down about chapter 6, I believe it is? What was one of the things that Amos mentioned in his condemnation of the nation of Israel? They lay upon their beds of ivory. They drink wine out of bowls. I mean, they were living it up. He goes ahead and talks about the as we would say, the party atmosphere that was often prevalent among those folks at that time. And he wasn't speaking that as a point of commendation to them, but rather condemnation to them as a nation. That's what is, in essence, taking place here. So in these verses, there is concern on the part of Lemuel, ever who that is, mother, that her son avoid the pitfalls of these things. Then the third admonition is found in verses 8 and 9. Open thy mouth for the dumb in the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and the needy. So the first admonition has to do with strong drink, with women. Second admonition has to do with strong drink. The third admonition has to do with judging righteously. Now, what would be more important for a king under those circumstances than these 3 points of admonition? Open thy mouth for the dumb. Who would the dumb be in that particular context, you think? Those who, for whatever reason, are unable to plead their own case, their own cause. Could be because of a tender age, of maybe not knowing exactly how to plead their case. It could be the effect of a lowly station in life where they were not permitted to plead their own case. Might be the situation of one's just simply being ignorant of what the law really is. Or maybe one who is just so timid that they do not possess the ability. So there are a lot of things that could make one be unable to plead their own cause. So what do you do for them? Just feel sorry for them and let them be treated badly anyway? Is that the deal? Well, absolutely not. The wisdom of the mother says to the king, you plead their case for them. The idea of being appointed in destruction here is imminent danger. So they are in immediate danger, imminent danger of something really bad happening to them if somebody doesn't plead their case for them. And so the wisdom of the mother to the king would be, you plead their case. Don't allow the poor, don't allow the needy to go unprotected, if you please. But open the mouth and judge righteously and plead the cause of the poor and the needy. So this chapter begins with that admonition. And certainly the admonition is good for us, whether we are referencing those who are in leadership positions or those of us who are in positions to follow. The advice in these 9 verses is certainly just as applicable tonight as it was when it was written back during the time of the writing of the Proverbs. Then in verse 10 is the section where he begins to talk about the virtuous woman, or the worthy woman, as she is sometimes referred to in that regard. And the question is raised, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. Is the first phrase of the question creating doubt that such a person exists? No, it's not creating doubt. Should not create doubt. It's really asked for point of emphasis. And then he goes on to give a very detailed description of the woman who could be so described as a virtuous woman in that regard. And as we read through the various aspects of this woman's character and life, really what you have is a combination of moral goodness on the one hand and bodily vigor and activity on the other hand. Here's a woman who is upright in her life, who's also vigorous, who's also energetic, who's also very active in her life. And that's really the 2 main points of emphasis that you'll see throughout all of these descriptive phrases within these verses. So probably within these verses you have the greatest tribute that could be given to a woman. I wish I could remember how many times through the years I've been asked by women to use this section of Scripture at their funeral, assuming that I would be around when they died. And I've used it on a number of occasions. But as we read through this section, I think you'll realize that this is not just a reference to a good woman. This is a reference to a very special lady. And certainly, as we sometimes say in our society, the writer of this description of this worthy woman sets the bar pretty high, doesn't he? It's certainly something to which all women could aspire. It's something that could be used as perhaps the greatest example for womanhood, for motherhood, for other aspects of her life that are revealed in this section. So it is a section that women ought to take very seriously. And of course, someone described this lady as the perfect housewife, the chaste helpmate, the upright, God-fearing, economical, wise woman. Now, that's a pretty good list of adjectives there to describe this worthy woman. And so she is described. Her price is far above rubies. What's the significance of that statement? Much of what you find in the history of this particular day? What were some of the most valuable possessions that were had? Various stones. Various stones. And so God, through the penman here, uses something that is considered of among the greatest things of greatest value of that day as a parallel, and to say of this woman that her price is that of rubies, right? No. Far above. So however one might value the stones of the day that they possessed, it does not begin to compare with the value of this virtuous woman. So that puts a pretty high price on such a woman as this. Then he begins in verse 11 to give some very specific aspects of this woman to make her of such value, and so described. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. What's the first part of the verse? The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her. All right? Perhaps the highest degree of confidence. When he leaves home, when he goes to work, he can have full confidence in his helpmeet, as is stated in Genesis chapter 2, that she's going to act in a very discreet way, that she's going to promote his interest while he's absent. Take your Bible now and turn back to chapter 7 for just a moment. I want to show you a very sharp contrast with what is said in this regard. In chapter 7, backing up to verse 7, I want to read a little bit lengthy reading here. Verse 6, For at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and I beheld among the simple ones, I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner. Now, who is her? Well, you back up a few verses, and he's already mentioned the strange woman in verse 5. So that's the context. And he went the way to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night. And behold, there met him a woman with the attire of an harlot and subtle of heart. She is loud and stubborn, her feet abide not in her house. Now is she without, now in the streets, lieth in wait at every corner. So she caught him and kissed him, and with an impudent face said unto him, I have peace offerings with me. This day I have paid my vows. Therefore came I forth to meet thee, diligently to seek thy face, and I have found thee. I have decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, with carved works, with fine linen of Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves with loves. Now watch verses 19 and 20. For the goodman is not at home. He is gone a long journey. He hath taken a bag of money with him, and will come home at the day appointed. And with her much fair speech she caused him to yield. With the flattering of her lips she forced him. But now notice verse 19 and 20. Here's the goodman of the house. He's gone on a journey. What's he going to find when he comes home? Is he going to find the woman that's described in Proverbs 31? No. He's going to find just the opposite. A woman who's not concerned for his welfare. A woman who is not a woman of discretion. And so in that regard, you have a very sharp contrast between the picture that's painted in chapter 7 and the picture that's painted in chapter 31. And so he can leave home with every confidence. And so the latter part of the verse, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She is a very good manager of domestic affairs. Other references within the Proverbs or within these verses, description of her will suggest this, but that one statement alone would suggest that she's not a spendthrift. That she's not loose and irresponsible with her spending. And I said other things along the way will help us to see that she's more interested in the benefits that she can gain, the increase that she can gain for her husband and for her household than she is being wasteful with those things. Go back to chapter 7. How is this woman spending her money? On things that were used to allure a man into her house that didn't belong to her. Quite a contrast. Interesting, to say the least. But this is that virtuous woman. Her husband doesn't have to worry about her. She is pure. She is discreet. She knows how to take care of domestic matters, and so he doesn't have to worry about coming home and finding things in worse shape than when he left. But they'll be in better shape. In verse 12, she will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Well, the ideas of doing good and not evil is pretty much self-explanatory. But to me, the interesting phrase in this verse is all the days of her life. Now, what's going to happen during the days of her life? Are things always going to be great? No, they're going to be ups and downs. There are going to be good times and there are going to be bad times. But it doesn't matter about that. Here's a woman whose love for her husband is based on high principle, not circumstances. Circumstances are going to change. Oftentimes in our marriage ceremonies, one of the things that we ask of both the prospective husband and wife, do you take this man, do you take this woman to be the rest of that you know, in sickness and in health, in prosperity and in adversity? What are we saying? What are we asking? Regardless of the circumstances, you're going to be faithful to your mate. That's all we're asking. That's the case that's presented here toward this woman. Regardless of the circumstances that may come and go, she is going to do him good all the days of her life. Where's her interest? Where's her interest? For him, in her husband. Now, there are other sections again that we'll see, suggesting that she is unselfish, not only with regard to her husband, but with regard to others who have need. And that's along the latter part of the section that we'll be looking at. So that, to me, that's the real key phrase in verse 12. All the days of her life, good or bad, coming and going, circumstances do not determine how she treats her husband. Her love for him, based on those high principles, is what governs her reaction to her husband. In verse 13, she seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. We're probably familiar with wool. That's been used through the centuries in the making of clothes. What is the flax here? She seeketh wool and flax. What is that? Huh? It is a plant that is cultivated from which thread is made. It's interesting, Deuteronomy chapter 22, just as a little side note here. Deuteronomy chapter, 22, verse 11, part of the law. Thou shalt not wear a garment of divers sorts, as of woolen and linen together. And so the flax is that which was cultivated to produce the thread that would ultimately produce the linen cloth for the garment. And so while both of them are mentioned in this verse, according to the law, they were not to be mixed. And so they could not both be used, they just could not be mixed. Just a little side note in that regard. But she seeketh those things. And again, to me, the key phrase, she worketh how? Willingly. What does that mean? She's not lazy. What, Jimmy? She's not being compelled to do it. She's not lazy about it. Not only is she diligent, but she obviously finds pleasure in doing it. So that's why I said a while ago, this virtuous woman is not just any good woman. But when you begin to break down these various thoughts about her life, there is a lot involved that produces this virtuous woman. Verse 14, she's like the merchant ships. She bringeth her food from afar. And what do the merchant ships do? They travel great distances to bring in whatever. And it would seem to me, in this regard, being like a merchant ship, she buys the best. And you see that implicated throughout these verses. She's always providing the best for her family, for those who have need. She's always thrifty in doing what she's doing. And in order to accomplish that, she does it without regard to distance. In other words, she'll go to whatever lengths necessary to provide the best at the best price. That's pretty thrifty, isn't it? That's concern, and that's why you'll notice in the latter part of verse 11, her husband's not going to have any need of spoil because of her extreme interest in having the best at the most economical advantage possible. Verse 15, she riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She ariseth while it's yet night. Before daylight. Okay. How many women does that eliminate? Don't answer that. All right. What does that say? Does that mean you really have to get up before daylight to be called a virtuous woman? Well, not necessarily. It's just showing how diligent she was. If that's what it took to provide what her family and her help, whoever was involved, later on the poor that she's going to help, whatever she had to do, to whatever length she needed to go, regardless of how early she needed to get started, she was going to see that the job got done. There's nothing lazy about this woman. Nothing whatsoever. She gets things done. She gets it done right. Verse 16, she considereth the field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hand she planteth a vineyard. To me, verse 16, one of the key words, at least in the first phrase, is considereth. In that context. She does what? She considers a field and buys it. What's the significance of that? Huh? She doesn't just rush into something without giving due consideration to it. Huh? She prepares. And so, there are probably a lot of fields that she could have bought. But would they have been as productive? Would they have been to the advantage of her and what she's trying to do? She considered, she thought about it. She understood what she was doing, and that's the real significance of it. She gave proper consideration to it in that regard. And of course, the idea of considering a field and buying it and planting the vineyard, she's providing for future needs, isn't she? She's making preparation for what's going to happen on down the road. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. So she takes care of her own health. She takes care of her own strength. She's concerned about her husband. She's concerned about her maidens. She's concerned a little bit later on of those who are in need. But she also is concerned about herself. And I think there's a lesson here that really needs to be considered. Sometimes we find ourselves in difficult situations in life of trying to care for people who are in need, and oftentimes in a physical sense. If we're not careful, sometimes we can do that to the detriment of our own well-being. God doesn't expect that of us. Yes, we have to do what we can to take care of others, but God also expects us to take care of ourselves. Not to the exclusion of others, but in harmony with what we're doing for others as well. Jim, do you? I recall early on, my years of preaching, I think I heard this statement at least one time. You always have time to take care of everybody else's problems, but you don't have time to take care of ours. I think I heard that once or twice somewhere back a few years ago. And that's quite possible, isn't it? We've always got time for everybody else. How many of you have known people who would do anything in the world for somebody else but wouldn't do anything for their own family? I've known people like that. But in this particular case, it's just simply saying she also takes care of her own health and her own well-being in addition to taking care of others as well. So again, God does not expect of us to help others to the detriment of our own well-being. We need to give that consideration. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. Merchandise is good. She manufactures the best, doesn't she? She's doing the best that she can do. Now, in that statement, she perceives that her merchandise is good. There's no sense of arrogance or conceit in that, but just a legitimate, healthy pleasure in the fact that she has been providentially rewarded for good work. That's what's been said up to this point. How diligent, how discreet, how hardworking she is. And when she looks over what she's done, can she feel good about it? Yes, she can feel good about it. And that's what we ought to be. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves if we attempt to do anything in such a way that the end product is going to be shameful just simply because of our laziness or negligence in the process. If we've done the best we can do, that's one thing. But if out of laziness and indifference we produce a shoddy product, whether it's something that we make, the work that we do for the cause of Christ, whatever it is, we have to look at it and be ashamed of it, then we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. This woman wasn't that way. All right, Lord willing, we'll pick up there and finish this section next week.